Sartre's Being and Nothingness sets out to investigate the relationship between the human being and the world, between consciousness and the being that is transcendent of consciousness. A very distinctive notion that Sartre puts forward is that consciousness is a kind of nothingness that cuts into the fullness of being. Last time we talked about how being is a plenum with no room for any negation inside of it, and consciousness is what brings negation, possibility, and so on to the table. So Sartre will say things like, nothingness lies coiled at the heart of being, and nothingness haunts being. So as evocative as these are, and Sartre can be very evocative as a literary author, what does he mean in a concrete sense when he says things like that? Sartre begins by noticing, following Heidegger, that human beings are the kind of being that questions things, and in particular, questions their own being, especially when we're doing things like metaphysics. So to investigate being, Sartre decides to question the questioner. And this is what he'll do throughout Being and Nothingness. He'll take a look at some particular mode of human activity, and he'll then ask, what must be the structure of being to make that kind of activity possible? Sartre's first observation is that the activity of questioning presupposes the possibility of a negative answer. For example, if I ask, does the human being have a soul? I have to be ready for the possibility that the answer to that question is no, it's not the case that a human being has a soul. So the kind of being we are, one that asks questions, presupposes negation. Questioning is an act of facing up to the possibility of something not being the case. It's essentially, according to Sartre, a negative stance on the world. It has to be able to look at the possibilities of what is and also what is not. It has to be able to deny what is in order to investigate what might be. So we've come to the idea that negation is crucial for human activity. What makes negation possible? This is a question that goes back to ancient philosophy. Parmenides introduced this problem when he argued that it's impossible to think about what does not exist. What is, and what is not. So you can't even talk about what's not because there's nothing there to talk about. But there's something insufficient about Parmenides' line of thought, at least according to most people who have followed him, and certainly according to Sartre. We can think about things that don't exist, and we do this routinely. We can think about mythological creatures, we can think about Harry Potter, and the rest. But if Sartre's right, even when we think about things that do exist, this requires the possibility of negation. Suppose we come upon a bridge and we ask ourselves, does the bridge support 50 tons? In posing that question, we have to be prepared to face up to negation in three ways. First, there's negation in being. We're entertaining the possibility that the bridge itself does not have the property of sustaining 50 tons. Second, there's the negation in our knowledge. There could be a gap or a lacuna in what we know. We're admitting when we ask the question that we don't know whether the bridge will sustain 50 tons. Finally, the third way is negation in truth. Whenever you say something that's true, what you're doing is excluding a whole range of possibilities as false or not the case. You're negating everything else in order to highlight the one thing that you're saying is true. So if we say the bridge does sustain 50 tons, then we're saying it's not the case that it sustains 60 tons, or it's not the case that it sustains 70 tons. Now, earlier we mentioned Parmenides, and we should give a little bit more context regarding the problem that Sartre is addressing here. Plato is another ancient philosopher who thought this question about negation and nothingness was at the heart of philosophy in many ways. In Plato's Euthydemus proposes a notion of truth. Euthydemus says, the person who speaks what is and things that are speaks the truth. In other words, if what you say in your words matches what exists, that's when you're speaking the truth. Now, the lesson that Plato derives from this idea is that speech needs a subject matter. There needs to be something we're talking about. When I say the coffee mug is on the table, that's made true by its subject matter, something that actually exists, the coffee mug and the table. But what if I say there's no hippos in the room? Now that seems to be true, at least as far as I can tell. But what makes it true? There aren't any hippos that could make it true. And if there were hippos, then it would be false. So we can see here what Parmenides had in mind when he said you can only speak about what exists. Plato's solution is to appeal to the notion of difference. To say that there are no hippos in the room is to say that this room is the same as a room with hippos in it in many ways, but it's also different than a room with hippos in it. If that's the strategy, we don't have to appeal to any non-existent hippos or some negative fact to make our statement that there are no hippos true. We just have to survey all the positive truths, the things that really do exist in this room, and notice that having hippos in it is not compatible with all of those truths about the room. But Sartre remains unsatisfied with something like Plato's position. He wants to draw our attention to two very different kinds of cases. Suppose you arrange to meet your friend Pierre at a cafe. You arrive at the designated time, and you see that Pierre is not there, and you think to yourself, Pierre is not here. Now contrast that very common type of experience with the thought that there are no hippos in the room. There's something artificial about the thought that there are no hippos in the room, as distinct from the case of arriving and seeing Pierre's absence in the cafe. The absence of hippos in the room has nothing to do with reality. It's a completely abstract notion. I just cooked it up in my mind for no real reason whatsoever. If I didn't have this thought about hippos, there would be no absence of hippos in the room. That's solely an aspect of my judgment, a purely subjective notion that I brought to bear. But is all negation like that? Sartre says no, and if we think about the case of Pierre, it brings out what he has in mind. Pierre's absence is something I discover. I didn't discover the absence of hippos in the room. I just cooked that up in my mind. But when I arrive at the cafe and I survey around and I look for Pierre, I discover that he's not there. Now, of course, Pierre's absence depends in some way on my expectation that he would be there. If someone arrived at the cafe who's not friends with Pierre and had no plans to meet him, they would not be able to discover his absence. But it's different than the case of the hippos. But Sartre says, my expectation has caused the absence of Pierre to happen as a real event concerning this cafe. And that's the difference between the Pierre's absence case and the no hippos case. There's no process of judgment involved. I don't have to think about Pierre's absence. I arrive at the cafe and I see his absence. That's different than the hippos, which were merely a figment of my judgment that there are no hippos in the room. So Sartre thinks that in the case of Pierre's absence, we have a reality of non-being. For this, Sartre uses the words negentity, and that's to be opposed to entity, something that exists. A negentity is something that does not exist. Just like the mugs on the table and the chairs in the cafe are entities that have their ontological basis in being, negentities are nothingnesses that have their possibility in the ontological category of nothingness. So negation is not merely an aspect of our logic and our judgment. It's actually based in what exists ontologically. So to apply this to our previous discussion, Pierre's absence at the cafe is a negentity, whereas the hippos are not a negentity. Those are just something that I cooked up in my mind. So this is Sartre's strategy for pushing nothingness and negation into the ontology. And why does he want to do that? Well, he thinks that that will better account for the nature of consciousness and the nature of being human. It's in human experience to experience nothingnesses, to experience absences, to disengage. And that's why Sartre thinks nothingness needs to be in the ontology. It's not something that we have only in our minds. It's something we find out there in the world.